All right, folks, welcome back for another Rifhtbound 101 episode. We are December 24th. I plan to pre-record this, but holidays get in the way of things. Today we are going to be covering Lee Sin more in depth. This is another In Focus episode, and the last one just had like a lot of requests for Lee Sin, and there's been a bunch of you over the last couple of weeks asking me for it, so I figured this is probably the right time. So that's the plan for today. And did I left some Yasuo stuff in here. Anyways, as usual, we're gonna be covering core concepts, the key pieces you're likely to find in Lee Sin. I'm gonna discuss like how to refine Lee Sin or what's like what the field is like for him, and then as always, like budget versions, experimentation with different deck archetypes, all that good stuff. The one thing that I'm going to be pretty upfront about is I'm not going to be covering the Dazzling Aurora Lee build, which I've seen pop up here and there, and I think the reason why is because I'm going to leave Aurora for a different episode where I'm going to discuss it because it's really like hyper dominant across basically every orange legend except for Set. And I don't want to devote like half an episode across like four different in focuses. I'd rather just do one that's for Aurora. Okay, so one of the questions you can always ask when you're looking at like a legend is, what is the core function of my legend? So Blind Monk gives you pay one energy, exhaust, and buff a friendly unit, which requires A, that you want to buff, or that buffs do things for you, or that you can expend them, and B, that you have friendly units to buff. The other way to cover this is to think, well, okay, what does Lee give me that other heroes that want buffs can't get? Because, for example, Set likes buffs as well. Leona uses them and produces them as well from stuns. So a good way to think about Lee, in my mind, is as a arena bar that doesn't need to be played, and will be discounted the first three times, or the first two times you use it. The third time it breaks parity, and then later on it becomes a more expensive arena bar. But it lets you buff things in turn one. So one thing that Lee can do that some other legends cannot do reliably is on turn one play a 2-drop, and then on turn two, buff it and have energy open to push into a battlefield and then start holding pretty intensely. Now, the elephant in the room is Lee better than Master Yi? Because the buff will give you +1, Master Yi's ability gives you +2 on defense. And I think in general, the consensus and tournament results would show that Yi is a bit better. But the things that Yi can't do is he can't really give you value if you're playing more than one unit in a battlefield, which is one of the things that you want to be doing depending on the build of Lee. And the other one is you don't get the buff on attack. So Yi has some additional trouble reestablishing board a bit more than Lee does. Lee and Yi is gonna like mess me up the whole video. Anyways. Um so this is the main deck curve for Jeff John's top 64 Lee Sin from the Houston Regional Qualifier. You can notice a pretty clear pattern. Like most green decks, Lee decks tend to play a lot of cheap tricks. Defy, On Guard, Discipline, these are all like very prevalent in these lists as well. And again, you see some amount of 3 and 4 drops, but a dominant amount of 2 drops so that you can play them on turn 1. And then you get like your late game beaters. So this version of the list really is on Tasty Fey Folks and Deadbloom Predators, which you can imagine makes the deck pretty expensive. And the one gear that you do run in this version is Zonia's Hourglass on 2. So like your opening play is usually a 2-drop or a Zonia's. And then if you're second, you have some amount of 3 drops. There is a different deck that I'm going to be talking about a bit later, which is Green Lee. And Green Lee builds and plays entirely differently. It's almost like two different legends. Green Lee does not play any 2-drop units. It in fact plays only 3/4 cost units. Plays 1 copy of Set Brawler and 1 copy of Green Lee Sin. And this deck really is the protect the president style, Voltron style. Like, I'm gonna load up a bunch of buffs, I'm gonna use them, I'm gonna make 1 or 2 units very big, and I'm gonna take battlefields. Whereas the other Lee really is built around holding battlefields. This one is a bit more back and forth. And just like a really super compact energy curve, more or less like nothing above 4, and you'll like sometimes see your set, like your 1 out of 39 cards that is at 5 energy, and your like reliable 5 energy play is going to be Greenlee Sin that you can like buff over and over and over. So one of the things that you can see with the like Jeff John's main list is that Lee tends to play a healthy amount of turn 1 drops, but not as many units as some of the other decks. So only 7, and he fields 13 pieces of card draw. Some of that is contingent on having units on the board to exhaust. Like, you don't get as much from meditation if you don't have something. And then 14 pieces of interaction. So across the board, this is actually a bit lower than when I was doing like the Yasuo list. This is a bit less interactive outright, except you're kind of putting bigger units on the board to just force your opponent into them, and it depends on whether or not you consider, Lee's legend to be a form of interaction that is like forcing opponents to use cards, otherwise you can like just get above them. And I think the difference between having like a good game with Lee and a bad game with Lee is if you can push your units 1 might above removal, you're going to feel pretty like ironclad, because then you force them to produce additional pieces of removal or to have bodies to commit on top of removal, and you can just sit on interaction, you can sit on your disciplines, you can defy their stuff. I think the Green Lee actually runs like Windwall main deck, so you can Windwall like Acathian Rains or Falling Stars. And that's really it. Like a lot of the other Calm Legends, the name of the game is like protect your units. A lot of your interaction is very good, but it does require a board to do much. And you're going to need to think through that might math, right? You're going to need to constantly be on the lookout for how many runes does my opponent have open, how many cards in hand, what have I seen this game, what's the likelihood of them being on like Falling Star or Hextech Raid or Void Seeker. If you're like turn 1 or turn 2 you're attacking and you want to see, you can like probe with a discipline or an on guard, and then if they don't commit removal, you can be reasonably sure that they don't have it. And for the rest of the game, then you have to like count number of draw to figure out like, are they on just a handful of units, or do they just not have like the right size of removal? So Lee rewards like very judicious play, and I think he's part of the like all the green decks do this for me, but it's very like brain burnery, to put it in not a super scientific way. The key pieces. So usually small units is the name of the game. I think Lee reworks that a little bit well, which is he wants bodies that wear buffs well. And some units are just small and they provide buffs, like Pit Rookie. Others, however, are going to be like units that you really want to sit buffs on. You've got your, bleed interaction, a cheap draw. And then you have like a suite of late game beaters. And I think there's like 2 units I'm not going to talk about in that section, which I will talk about in the final deck. And that's like Green Lee and Kiana, which I think are super important units. They're just like their own thing. So, the small boys, redacted small boys. You've got your Pit Rookie, which, your 2 might for 2 will buff another unit. So you're okay playing this by itself because you can buff it with Lee. Evidently, if you draw it later, you can like play Stalwart Poro on 1, and then on 2 you can play Pit Rookie, buff the Stalwart Poro, and then buff the Pit Rookie with Lee, and have like 1 mana left over for non-guard, push the Stalwart Poro in. You can do a lot of stuff, so you have to like figure out your interactions. Clockwork Keeper, always a bit on the lower end of the 2 drops, but will give you an out to draw later in the game. I think burning a rune to draw early is pretty risky. Being behind on a rune means you have like less options for interaction for a while. So, be careful with that. And then Sunlight Guardian is a card that I'm somewhat surprised to see in lists still. I think it's because it's a 3 might, 3 cost unit with shield, which does put it at 4, and in a whole deck is great, but it's still one of those cards that has like the asterisk, like dies to 1/2 of Falling Star. If you play it and protect it though, if you can push this up to 4, and that's kind of the plays, like you're on 4 energy, you play this, you buff it to 4, then I'm a lot like higher on this card, and I think it has a good space in the deck, and then it becomes like a 5 might defender. So like a lot of other decks, Lee wants to play units into battlefield so that they can hold. But unlike the Yasuo, for example, you're not going to do like the 1-2 push into battlefield super aggressive opener. You're going to take them like one by one and protect them, and you're going to force your opponents to commit like more cards than they're happy to. Or you can charm enemy units into them. You got your get over interaction, so discipline, on guard, defy for like your Hextech Rays or your Void Seekers. Actually, recount. Defy I think is 3 or less, so not Void Seeker, but my brain is like foggy right now. So again, the name of the game is always like try to engage when you're 1 might over so that your opponent has to interact first, and then you hold up energy and you punish them for it with like disciplines or on guards. So yeah, be aware that this deck does have like some issues dealing with fight or flight, which is the case for green decks that are not in purple. And Defy should generally be kept, I think, 4 off, or for Call the Weak if you're against yellow is pretty bad. But you use it when you can. Your big boys. So this is the Jeff Johns version, and I'm gonna go through this, like pretty quickly. Dead Bloom. It's big. It has 8 might. You can play to an enemy occupied battlefield, and it has deflect. I like it a little bit less than Yi for the simple reason that like Lee needs to work harder to make it defend well. So for example, your opponent has like a 6 might unit on a battlefield. You drop Dead Bloom. You burn 2 runes, and it's an 8 cost attacker. And just like you can interact with it and give it like pluses if you have on guards or whatever. But then you go to defense, and you have to pay an extra energy to give it a buff, and it'll be a 9 might unit, and you've spent like 9 energy. Whereas he gets a 10 might unit, and he doesn't have to spend the energy. Granted, Lee does get that might against removal, but if people are like piling on multiple removals into a Dead Bloom Predator's deflect, it's already like pretty bad for them. So I don't think that's like a make or break thing. So Dead Bloom is still like amazing. I just think it's less good here than it is in a lot of other decks because of the awkwardness of how to sequence Lee's buffs with it. Tasty Faithbook, on the other hand, I think is actually a bit better here than it is in Yi decks or in other green decks, because you can play it out for its accelerate, buff it, and then you have a 7 might accelerate that has the channel 2 runes and the draw 1. Tasty Faithful, just like great value in general. And then Udyr is, I think, a pretty interesting card that only Lee really likes in any capacity. So you play him, you can buff him and then spend the buff to ready him and have like an accelerated target. You can also stun a unit. You can deal 2 damage to a unit at a battlefield without sending him in. And sometimes you'll get ganking with him. So an example of this is if you play him and your opponent's on like a super risky board, you can buff him to ready him, and then you spend it to ready him. You push him into a battlefield, you take that battlefield. And then you can also like remove a unit on another battlefield if you can rebuff him with like Stand United or something. In other cases, you can start at a battlefield, spend his buff, give him ganking, go to the other battlefield, re-ready him, push him back. There's a lot of stuff you can do with Udyr. I just think he's slightly overcosted, but he works here, and this is like his home deck. And then your chosen champion, if you're on that list, is Lee Sin Centered. Lee Sin Centered gives you like 2 things. He gives you a reliable accelerated threat, a bit like Master Yi. And the other one is you can sit him at a battlefield with a lot of other buffed units to make like a big fort. This is kind of why Set uses him as well. And the Jeff Johns version, unsurprisingly, is on a lot of whole battlefields, which we can talk about right now. Oh, actually, I'm going to talk about some other stuff. So the other thing that I think separates Lee a little bit from other decks is base removal. So because Lee is playing a lot of units early compared to Master Yi, you can often utilize them for challenges or charms. And also his champion spell, I think, is a lot better than Yi's champion spell. So Dragon Rage usually only run like one copy, but some decks might be on a bit more. It's kind of like a turbo charm, right? You can move an enemy anywhere, and then you choose another enemy at its location, and they deal damage to each other equal to their mights. So if you just play this as a regular charm, it's 3 more expensive. But you can often play 2 units into each other and just like nuke them, or produce like some situations where you can like send in, a Darius into a battlefield. He'll kill like a Kaisa, and then you can like go in and kill it. I think the applications are slightly narrow, but you can do some pretty funky stuff. And crucially, because you're moving 2 enemies into a location and they're the same user, it doesn't start a showdown, so the damage will not reset until the next fight. So, sometimes you can set up like a 2-for-1, but you're like not in the colors that would, take the most advantage out of this. Like you can't stupefy a unit so that like both die instantly and you draw a card back, or you don't have access to red removal. So just, it's a bit awkward, but it's still like a really good spell. And what these spells do, and you often run like 3, 3, and 1, is they give you like 7 sources of things that hit in base, which is still a pretty rare effect, all things considered. And then, yeah, the fields. So Lee runs Monastery of Hirana, same as Set and Leona. I think that after Set, who like just has access to a ton of buffs by default, Lee is the most like able to spend buffs on units. And one of the things that you're going to be able to do, for example, is like buff a unit, send it to Hirana, draw 1, which effectively turns Lee's ability into like 1 energy, draw 1, which is very good. The only problem is Monastery is only like 1 game out of 3. And so what are the other battlefields? The Jeff Johns version runs Grove of the Godwillow. You're holding, you draw more cards, and then Windswept, which is kind of like the field that you like playing when you're going second, and allows you to like catch up. So theoretically, like game 1, you're playing Monastery, you win, you go to Windswept on game 2, and then you like lose. And if you lose, you get to go first in the 3rd game, and you pick up Grove. You could theoretically also use Grove first, but I think I prefer Monastery in game 1 for sure. So the fields I think are pretty set, and Monastery is going to be run in every version. I think some of the green Lee versions, instead of running Grove, run Dreaming Tree. That's always a risk into Kaisa and Annie right now. And your 3rd battlefield, I think, is you're safe using Windswept most of the time, especially since you're running things like you're running like a fair amount of accelerated units that you're happy to push there, and then like next turn move into a different battlefield. The matchups. I mean, Lee's like nightmare matchup is Kaisa. But by the accounts of many people who play him competitively, and not my feelings, you'd think that like green has a good chance into it. It turns out it's just really hard to trade into Kaisa profitably because the spells end up being so cheap. If Kaisa falls off, or Lee gets to run more of the deflect units that are coming in, he should do a bit better. But, like the joke is still like stupefies feel pretty bad into you, as does like Void Seeker, and they're happy like trading. Kaisa's units tend to be valued less than your units are, so they're happy committing like 2 or 3 cards that draw them cards, and then like Raven Bloom into a card that you really need to stick on the board. So you're kind of playing on the back foot for a lot of these. Exception being if you ever get to like sit a fort of like Lee Sin cards, like Lee Sin centered and like a bunch of like buffed units around him. Kaisa then has like a lot of trouble breaking through that, and that's kind of like your big win condition is like buff a couple units, send them to one place, hold, play Orange Lee Sin, make it like untakeable, even if they're using things like Acacia Rain or anything. Often, the thing that will sneak a game with Kaisa is that you're going to feel like pretty secure on one point, and you're going to leave the other one open, and they're going to like send in a Noxus Hopeful and time warp it. And if you're not on win wall, it's going to feel pretty bad. The other one that is a bit tricky is Yi. The Yi matchup honestly feels kind of like a mirror. They tend to play some of the same cards, and they play at a slightly slower tempo. And if you've watched my tempo video, being the player that is slightly slower is always good because you slightly outvalue your opponent for minimal investment. It's a bit of an issue. And so Lee, I think, is just kind of he has like one really bad matchup in one of the top 4 decks, and the other, and he has like a deck that plays kind of like him but a bit slower. If there are new and more exciting ways to spend buffs, don't come at me for Simian Ancestor because I think that card is awful. Then I think Lee will like some of the more like unit based and equipment based battlefield stuff. And Lee also will probably like Triforce, although he's going to have the issue of like he's also going to start competing with Jax for like equipment strats. So you really just want like more buff cards in green specifically if you want Lee to like do better. But as always, these matchups are winnable. It's just a question of like they're not going to feel like the most comfortable to play. Okay. Yeah, so this is what I wanted to talk about instead of like innovation or like, like settling scores is the fact that orange and green Lee are kind of not played to the same extent. So orange really favors like 90% of the Lees I've seen. The accelerate is super important and is a good catch-up mechanic. And so the green version, which I would call like it's kind of like medium slow, doesn't have that catch-up mechanic. And so the ideal thing you do with Lee Sin Aesthetic is you kind of sit him on a field and you just buff him twice a turn, and then even more, and you play Spirit's Refuge, and you play Stand United, and you just make him huge. And at a certain point, that's really hard to make like a winning strategy. In particular, it actually like decreases your win rate into Victor, because Victor can just sit back, make like 5 or 6 units, grand stratagem, and just dump like 40 plus power onto a battlefield, whereas you're putting up like 2 a turn. So it makes that matchup harder. It does make the Kaisa matchup slightly better, and it'll turn him into a real threat that I think is like less easy to deal with, especially if you have Spirit's Refuge and can give him deflect. So just be aware that the orange variant is really the one that's like mostly played. But I'm going to talk about the green variant because it's a lot cheaper to build. Yeah, so I covered some of this. I should have probably like flipped over. The green list that I have on hand is from a November 30th city challenge in I think Shenzhen. And really like that deck doesn't even run 2 drops. It only runs 3 to 5. And it's like all protection. So it's like Zonias and protection spells and like Mistfall and just like stuff to buff your units to the max, and then a little bit to utilize those buffs. But unlike Orange Lee that like spreads the buffs around, Green Lee just like really likes hoarding them if possible. The budget versions. So as usual, I like to recommend ways for people to get into these decks if you're interested in playing them. Chances are, if you are looking at this video, you purchased the Lee Sin champion deck that is a starter, which I think is not like the best starter, but if you have it, you have it. And it's about $20 now. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend like going and getting it, because what I'm going to show you, the budget list, is a downcycled version of that green Lee that I was talking about from Shenzhen. So this deck is about $30 instead of $20. You have to get green Lee, which doesn't come in the starter, and your expensive cards nominally are going to be like your Sonas. But everything else is like pretty dirt cheap. I tend to like 2 copies of Lee because this version runs less of some of the very good orange cards that are in like the green Lee actual like competitive deck. So you've got your suite of cheap removal, cheap interaction, Defy on guard, triple charm, discipline. You have like one of Mask of Foresight because you tend to sit on points a little bit more alone. Meditation for draw, find your center for draw, two wind walls for like big spells, and then your 3 cost units are sort of like your Sunlit Guardian. First mate, you're happy playing on its own, but you're also happy playing second, like in combination with something to like give pseudo accelerate. Sona, you like sitting on points because she's like marginally less defensive than Greenlee by default, but you'll get a lot of runes back, so you can like have access to an enormous amount of um, like spell mana to counter stuff. Primal Strength, pretty stock in orange lists. 3 is a bit high, but you really do want to like be able to just go over very big board pushes. And then Greenlee is sort of the superstar of this deck. You have a second one out of the champ zone so that if the first one dies, you can bring him back. The budget version of this deck has a bit more trouble keeping things alive than the actual like put together version. But you know your big play is going to be like play Greenlee on like 5 or 6. If you play him on 6, you can already pre-buff him with your only, and then like you can either ready him immediately. If you're on 9, you can play first mate and ready him. If you're on Mistfall, you can expend one of the buffs that you just played to also ready him and send him into a battlefield. Or just like if you're sending him somewhere, you can ready him with first mate and then tap him. You can exhaust him again to like rebuff him. And then Udyr is, you know, like a multi-function buff spender. I'm not like super hot on Udyr, but like 2 of is fine. Your battlefields, Monastery and Windswept we talked about, and Dreaming Tree because evidently this is a version that targets a lot more. And you run 2 Unyielding Spirits. This is like your anti-Acacian Rain, anti-Falling Star tech. That's really like the 2 things you want it for, but you're happy using it against like Void Seekers as well. And in the next set, you're going to be happy using it against Piercing Light. So, or more rarely, if you're against a blue deck, Unchecked Power also just like absolutely gets crushed by this card, and especially what happens, Unchecked Power is like less energy intensive than some other strats like Acacian Rain, but people tend to back their units out of battlefields before they use Unchecked Power, and so they get kind of like hyper punished by unyielding. Not like only, you know, negating the spell that they just played, but like also kind of making a lot of their actions very suboptimal. So I would recommend this as like a more starter friendly version of Lee. And if you can't get Sonas, I would probably be on the Elder that has like 4 energy and gets +1 for a buff. And I think that would drop the cost even further. But yeah, in general, like buy singles and you know make this deck on your own, and I think you'll be like much more advantage than just buying the precon. Now, the more experimental, like always, like tournament cutting versions are the more expensive lists. So this is the Houston RQ one that Jeff Johns ran. A lot of the pieces I've talked about. Challenge, super important for base interaction. Triple Zonias, you love keeping your stuff alive. And then the card that I did want to talk about is Kiana. Kiana, I think, is, if you are an orange player, almost certainly the most important purchase you can make at a medium to low budget. She has Deflect, which is a nightmare keyword for Kaisa. I played set in skirmishes, and having like 1 or 2 units that have Deflect is really brutal. It makes all their stuff like way less effective, and it makes them like burn their runes for a lot of this. It also lets you rechannel her rune the first time, but draw cards if you need to. Then evidently where most of the budget comes from is Tasty Feyfolk and Deadbloom. Now, if you are on most of the cards of this deck and you want to have like a mid-budget version, you could theoretically, well, not even theoretically, remove the Deadbloom Predators and play Snapvines. The deck will speed up. It'll look a lot more like the low to the ground Yi deck, but it will also drop your budget by like $200. So I would recommend that if you have like some amount of Kiana, some amount of Tasties. And then if you can't, you know, keep the Tasties, you can like trade them out for what would be like a reasonable like 5 cost. I suppose you could just put in like more Wizened Elders. The other thing that you can do here is if you were lucky enough to get a Proving Grounds, Lee doesn't mind Yi in this deck. So you could also trade the Dead Blooms for like Orange Lee, Orange Yi, and the Tasties for like Green Yi, and then you'd be reasonably happy. You can also make a hybrid of the two decks, but although I think Green and Orange Lee play so differently that you generally don't want to mix them. And then the sideboard, Rune Prisons, stuns are really great in general, but they're undervalued because they're attached to Leona. But Rune Prison is like pretty good at pushing up bigger units. This is really for like the Yi match or like the Aurora matchups. And then Sabotage for the same reason. You hit like Aurora, you hit some of the bigger spells like Acathian Rain, Time Warp. You're happy playing this turn 1 for sure. Battlefields, Grove, and Monastery. And because this is a much more like energy intensive deck, Obelisk of Power is the card of choice. This is like a late deck. Like when you see Deadbloom Predator, this is not a deck that's trying to win fast. So just keep that in mind. The Shenzhen third place list from that event that I was talking about a couple weeks back, completely different build. You might notice some of the spells look different, but really that's a lot of where like the similarity of this stops. The lack of Tasty Fey Folks and Dead Blooms and the inclusion of one set Brawler, which is kind of the like upgrade to Green Lee, is I think an indication that what this deck wants to do is play units earlier and protect them and try to score fairly aggressively. It plays Windswept, it plays Monastery, it doesn't play Grove, and it plays Dreaming Tree because you're going to be targeting your own units a lot. And be aware that Meditation targets your unit. So if you wake up a unit at Dreaming Tree and utilize Meditation and you exhaust that unit, you will draw 3 cards, if I'm not mistaken. The sideboard is super toolboxy, so one more Unyielding Spirit for that Kaisa matchup, Sabotage for Aurora, although because the deck is faster, you're a bit more favored into Aurora. Another Mask for like mirrors that you want to break math on. One Wielder of Water, probably if you want to go very early and cut set. Caitlin's weird. I'm not exactly like super into it, but I suppose the thing that you want to do with it is sit it behind a Sunlit Guardian and then like start pinging things at a different battlefield. Adaptatron, another one of that can wear buffs for the Aurora matchup. One Dragon's Fury and one Wild Claw Shaman to have like a bit more of a readied unit. I think the other card in this deck that is like super like important to the strat, it's Spirit's Refuge, which gives deflect and will once again make your units a bit harder to hit. And also Stand United. Now, Stand United in Lee and usually is not like good because you can buff your own units, but when you're playing Green Lee, you can rebuff Lee and you still get the +1 as well. So this is sort of what the green one looks like. And I think if I had my choice of what to recommend, I would sort of recommend building the budget version, upgrading into Green Lee, and then upgrading into Orange Lee if you like that, or just sitting on this. So 2 different play styles, very different budgets as well. I mean, listen, the starter is like $20, the budget's like 30. Green Lee is about 100 because the Zonias and the Kianas and the Set Brawler. Just like replace a Set Brawler with a Lee, it'll drop like $25. And then Orange is just like Dead Blooms. That's really what it is. So, experiment, find like tempo points that you like a bit better if you can't afford Dead Blooms. I think Dead Bloom's going to go down slightly with Spirit Forge, but it remains a unit that is like very hard to replicate, and so it will retain some of its value. So don't like bank on waiting for Spirit Forged and Dead Bloom's dropping to like $20 or something. I think they're going to probably stick around a bit higher than that, unfortunately. Yeah, I think that's it for Lee. A bit like Ari, Lee really wants you to choose the way that you want to play him. So either, your go wide Orange Lee version, or your go tall, like single or 2 unit style hold with Greenlee. I think Greenlee is more appealing. I think it's more unique than what Set can do with buffs, and I really like it. But really, like play the deck you like to play. And keep an eye for Spirit Force stuff. You never know how decks can change, and maybe the inclusion of Guardian Angel, like giving Greenlee like another 3 Zonias, is going to make him a lot more interesting to keep alive. So yeah, keep that in mind. Oh, plans for next Monday are to go through the Spirit Forged body cards. So we are on episode 4 of that, and it'll be the body legends. So Fiora, some Redux for Jax. Oh god, this is my brain on holiday mode. Fiora, Jax, orange, red, Lucian, and Sivir, which is going to be like the first time I think we get to cover that. So Fiora and Sivir are going to be like first time covers. Look forward to it. And then I'm still figuring out which legend I'm going to be covering for the In Focus next week. We are starting to like move into the second half. I've been like pretty, you know, uh, I've been abstaining from covering the big four. So like Yi, Kaisa, Annie, and Set, but we're getting closer to them now, and it's getting harder to dodge them. So it might be one of those, or it might be the Aurora decks. I'm not sure yet. Um, yeah, that's it for today. So I will see you next Monday, and happy holidays, whatever you celebrate, and happy week off if you celebrate none. And here's hoping your end of year is restful. Have a nice one, and I will see you next Monday. Bye.